The idea that there is an inevitable trajectory towards complex life, and perhaps towards something like humans, is a little bit wishful thinking. The origin of complex cells happened just once on Earth. If we think about other planets, the likelihood is elsewhere we'll find bacteria. And this idea that we are somehow more evolved than bacteria is not really true. I work on the deep history of life, the origin of life through to the evolution of early cells, and what that means for us today. Why do we age? Why do we get diseases? Why are we conscious? Why has there been long gaps, 2 or 3 billion years, where it's just bacteria and nothing else? And you can't explain that just in terms of genes. We wouldn't know anything about what happened in the first 2 billion years of life on Earth if it hadn't been for gene sequencing. But life is not only about information. It's about the structure of cells. It's about the turnover of molecules, how gases in the environment are converted into more molecules. None of this has anything to do with genes. All of this happens spontaneously. I think my work's important because it's asking some of the biggest questions in science. What I'm doing is putting back a side that's been missing for a long time, which is energy flow and its importance and how that changes the way that evolution happens. The strange thing is very few people in the world are thinking along those lines, and it has an ability to come up with an almost alternative view of the whole history of life. If I say origin of life to you, virtually everybody will say primordial soup. I think the idea of the primordial soup is a terrible idea. It just won't go away. And the thing about life is it has structure, it has movement, it's a continuous chemical reaction. And the problem with any kind of soup is it's not reactive. It doesn't have the flow of energy going through it. And so I think it's a really bad way of seeing the origin of life. And I much prefer to think about, well, what are cells doing and what's the simplest version of how do cells become animated? And are there geological environments that work that way? And the answer is yes, there are. I think life started down in the deep oceans, in hydrothermal vents. But the Earth was very different 4 billion years ago because there was no oxygen back then. And if you're working on the origin of life, which I do, then you're starting with really simple prebiotic chemistry. We're trying to do it under strictly anoxic conditions, so in the strict absence of oxygen. But the questions are really very simple questions about how can we have the simplest possible version of a hydrothermal vent in a lab. So we use, in a sense, as little technology as we can get away with. Nobody can agree about what complex life actually means. What I mean is the difference between bacteria and the kind of cells that make up animals and plants and single-celled organisms that eat other things. Our kind of cell, it's called a eukaryotic cell, which just means it's got a nucleus and the DNA is packaged away in the nucleus. They're a lot bigger, a lot more complex than bacteria. All these complex cells in plants, in animals, in fungi, they all have basically the same structure. Our kind of cell arose once in 4 billion years of evolution. And it seems to have been something of a bit of a freak accident. For 2 billion years we have just bacteria, and the bacteria remain as bacteria. Then we have an abrupt single origin of all complex cells that happens around 2 billion years ago. And then we have another long period of stasis until the Cambrian explosion, where suddenly animals appear. Nearly 100 million years after that before we get plants on land. Hundreds of millions of years longer, and then we're beginning to see humans evolving and consciousness as we would recognize it. What explains these long gaps? What kind of an evolutionary process gives rise to two types of life that live in completely different ways? Perhaps it's nothing to do with genes and information. Perhaps it's something to do with the cell structure. So we have these mitochondria, which were bacteria once, and they seem to have arisen around 2 billion years ago. And the answer is almost certainly that another cell got inside. And that changes the topology, it changes the way that energy works in cells. Now it's internalized, and that means you can expand, you can do different things. It opens up the floodgates to evolution. We are a continuous chemical reaction. We are continually burning food in oxygen. Life has a very central logic, which is to do with growth. Growth is really just doubling, it's converting whatever's in the environment into more of yourself. And we've got a circulatory system which is continually delivering oxygen right to the mitochondria deep within cells. Cells are tiny things, and the membrane is almost invisibly small. If you were to iron out the membranes in the mitochondria in our own body, you'd get about 4 football pitches worth of membranes, and all those membranes have got a charge across it, which if you were to shrink yourself down to the size of a molecule, is equivalent to a bolt of lightning. That's what's animating us. We're basically powered by electricity. We would not be moving at all if it wasn't for energy flow. That gives you different insights. Genes work in a specific environment. That environment is cells. Cells have a particular structure, and that structure conditions what the genes can and cannot do. And so when we bring energy into it, we begin to understand this peculiar trajectory of life on Earth. This is one thing in biochemistry which is really striking. The way that plant cells work, the way that bacteria work, the way that animals work, it's all the same. There is a commonality that gives me a very strong fellow feeling with the rest of life. This deep similarity in everything, then you have this amazing variation. It's astonishing that you can use these building blocks to come up with the world which is so different. That is the glory of evolution.